Hello and welcome to Upstack America's Oracle EBS Financials Functional Training. My name is Bob and I'm the lead senior consultant for Upstack America. And with me today I have Victor, who is also a senior consultant. And today we are handling lesson 3 of the SLA. And Victor, please walk us through.
Thank you, Bob, for the introduction, and welcome everybody to this lesson in our Oracle Financials Functional Training series. This is lesson 3 of our SLA module. In this session, I want us to talk about journal line definitions in more depth. We already introduced them in our previous session, so we are going to look more closely at what journal line definitions are and what they do. So we already said that journal line definitions, which are the configurable parts of which are some of the parts which you can configure using the accounting methods builder. They contain journal entry setup components, and those components we talked about them, which are the journal line types, the journal entry descriptions, and account derivation rules. So what I want us to do is to talk about these components. Hopefully we are going to cover journal line types and journal entry descriptions. But before we go into that, again, because we say that this SLA module, we might get lost in all the terminology and all the terms. Let's start again with a hierarchy. So we have the subledger accounting method, which we assign to our ledger, and it comprises the accounting application definitions, which determine how accounting is created for each of the modules. Okay, so the accounting application definitions are comprised of journal line definitions, which are what we are talking about at the moment. The other thing to remember is that journal line definitions are configured around event types. Okay, so the best way to think about it is that this SLA module determines how accounting is created. Okay, we create accounting for what? For events or transactions which are entered in the subledger modules. Okay, so for example, when we create a payables invoice and we validate it, that's the event, and we want to create accounting for that event. When we make a payment and write a check, that's an event, so we want to create accounting for that event, right? So it is around those events that we are determining how accounting will be created. Okay, so we already said this, that journal line definitions are associated with event types. So remember, we talked about the event entities, and then we have the event class and we have the event type. Okay, all right, so that was just tracing our steps so that we can be clear on where we are. So when we're talking about journal line definitions, we said that the journal line definitions, they have these components, which are the line types. We have the account derivation rules, and we have the journal entry descriptions. Okay. We also talked about in passing what each of these components do, or what we can configure them to do. And we said that line type, it determines, among other things, the side of the line, which means is it a debit or credit line, or the level of summarization. It also determines the balance. the balance type, is it account, is it actual or budget? We are going to talk about those in detail because this is what this session is about. Account derivation rules, they help us to come up with the account combinations, okay? And then the journal entry descriptions, which are responsible for the descriptions that appear in our journals at the line level and also at the header level. So now let's talk about journal entry descriptions, okay? So there's one thing we need to know about the journal entry descriptions. Journal entry descriptions are assigned at the header level and at the line level, okay? At the header level, a journal entry description is associated with an event type. At the line level, a journal entry description is associated with a line type. All right, so now let's talk about that. When we have a journal, we know we usually have the header section and we also have the line sections where the lines are, okay? At the header section, we usually enter information about that journal, all right? The description, there's usually information such as the date, okay, and the source of that journal. So we have already said that journal line definitions are associated with, and no, we already said that one event type creates one journal entry. What does that mean? For example, what is an example of an event type? When we create an invoice, right? When we create an invoice and we validate it, that's an event type. When we create for accounting for that event type, one journal entry is created or one journal is created. It may have 2 lines or very many lines, okay? So that journal will have a description at the header level, correct? Therefore, that description is associated with the event type because it is from that event type that the journal is created. So let's go back again. The event type is invoice validation. When we create an invoice and we validate it, accounting is created, and which means a journal entry is created or a journal is created. So that journal has, we know what a journal looks like. It has the header section and it has the line section, okay? So we can have descriptions at that header level, we know, and we can also have description for each line. So the description that is at the header level is associated with an event type. So what that means is that when we are creating a journal entry description at the header level, we associate it with an event type, okay? At the line level, it is associated with the line type. So as we are going to see further down this session, a line type corresponds to a line in the journal. So when we are creating a line type in SLA, basically what we are doing is that we are creating the logic or the rules of how the line will appear in the journal. And that includes, as we have talked about, whether that line will be a debit or a credit line, okay? Whether that line will show actual or budget balances. The other thing is that level of summarization for that line and all that stuff, okay? But we also know that for journal lines, we usually have a section where we can have a description for that particular line. So in SLA module, when we are configuring the line type, we can associate a journal entry description for that particular line type, so that when we create accounting, the logic which we have entered in that entry description will then go ahead and produce the information that will be seen on the journal line itself. Now, when you go and look at the journal. So, just to reiterate, journal entry descriptions can be attached can be associated with the event type, so that they produce descriptions at the header level for the journal, and they can be associated with a line type so that they can produce descriptions at the line level, right? So I hope that's clear. Now, journal entry descriptions are descriptive values, basically. That sounds a bit redundant, but let me explain. So when you enter a journal entry description, so for example, this one is for the line, okay? These are journal lines. We can say that this journal doesn't have a header section, okay? So these are just the lines. So these journal line descriptions are just basic descriptive values that tell us more about this line, okay? So they can tell us that this line, they can tell us the supplier for which we are paying this invoice. They can also tell us the invoice number and all that, okay? So that's what we mean that journal entry descriptions are basically descriptive values, okay? So when we are defining our journal entry descriptions, we can customize them so that we can determine what information will be displayed in that description. So as we have seen, some of the information we can have there is the invoice number, the supplier name, the invoice date, okay? So as we are going to see when we start doing the actual the practical part of it on the instance, when we are defining this logic for the journal entry descriptions, some of the values we enter are constant and some of the values we enter are derived from the source. So what do I mean? For example, you can say that you want your journal entry description to display the invoice number, the supplier name, and the invoice date. So in that description itself, which will be seen, you will have words saying that invoice number, and then like invoice number. Let me go back to that. Okay. So for example, here it can say supplier, and then it will show the name of the supplier, okay? And then it will show invoice number, and then it will show the number of the invoice. So you can have that as the logic for all your invoices, but of course the values will change depending on who is the supplier and what is the invoice number. So that supplier, which is then followed by the supplier name, is a constant value. That's something that you want to be shown in every invoice, okay? However, the actual name of the supplier will be removed from where? Will be removed from the source, and the source is the invoice itself. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So, for example, if we have more than one suppliers in our system, so for us we have Mjengo, and we have the other one. I think we created this big builders construction something. So if we create an invoice for, if we create accounting for an invoice from big builders, here it will show big builders. So that big builders will be derived from the invoice itself. The invoice number will also be derived from the invoice itself. So that is information that's coming from the source. Okay, but this text itself that says invoice, that tells you whatever is following here is the invoice number, is constant. And you can enter that. You can enter all that information when you're defining the logic for your journal entry descriptions. Okay. So it's a bit confusing. So let me now give you maybe a better example. Okay. So look at this. These are some of the journals that we have been creating. And by the way, just from looking at them, you can see some of the information that we've been talking about, right? So we have here, for example, in event class, invoices, event type is invoice cancelled, right? We have the date. Now we can see the journal entry description here. This one is at the header level, right? Meaning it is associated with the event type. Okay, so you can actually see in the description, you can see the event type here is invoice cancelled. So you have the invoice number. This would be a constant. Okay, then the invoice number itself would be derived from the source. That's the invoice number. You have the invoice date, and then you have the invoice description, which is empty here. And it's the same for this second journal, right? So this is a journal, and these are the lines. Okay, so here we can say that the lines themselves don't have descriptions that have been defined for them, and that comes from the journal entity description at the line type. Let's look at some more. So you can see for this one, the event type is the invoice was validated, which basically means we acknowledged this expense. You can see the invoice number coming from the source, and that's MJ1000. You can see the invoice date. So according to the logic defined in the journal entry description that's associated with this event type, this is the information that will be displayed on our journals. Okay, so I hope that clears up the concept a bit more. Okay, so the other thing to know about journal entry descriptions is that we can define conditions that determine what a journal entry description is displayed. Okay, so let's talk about this. So we have said that we can have journal entry descriptions that for the header level, which are associated with the event type, and for the line level, which are associated with the line type. Okay. So you can try to think of journal entry descriptions as what? As like particular entities. So you can think of you have a journal entry description which is called the invoice header description. Okay. And then you have another journal entry description which is called the invoice line description. So if you want to define whatever information is going to appear at the header level, you will take that journal entry description called invoice header and attach it to that event type. The logic that you have defined in that journal entry description is what will produce this information that we are seeing here. Okay. Now we have conditions. You can determine. You have conditions which also can determine what information is displayed here. Okay. For example, we have a feature called document sequencing. Okay. So if we are using document sequencing, we can say that we would like the description here to show that sequence number. Okay. Therefore, just the way we have this text, invoice number, then the invoice number itself, we would have another text here saying sequence number or document sequence number, and then the number itself. Okay. However, remember that it is still a journal entry description at the header level. Okay. However, so the conditions would be that if we are using that document sequencing, then we would want that that option to display the document sequence number to appear here. So in our case, the way we have been doing our setup, we are not using the document sequencing. Okay. So we don't have that displayed here. Okay. But we can define conditions in our journal entry description, okay, that says in the event that the field where we enter the document sequences, because it's somewhere you'll enter that number, in the event that something is entered in that field, then this journal entry description will display that document sequence number here. Okay. So as we are going to see when we go, I'm avoiding to go to show you the actual screen because we want to understand the concept first before now we go there. So basically it is the same journal entry description, okay, but it has levels, like levels of logic, okay, that tell it, depending on the information that has been entered in a certain place, then this is what will be displayed in the particular journal. All right. So I hope that's clear. If it's not, it will become more clear when we go to do the actual implementation. So that's it for journal entry descriptions. The thing to remember is that they can be attached, they can be associated with the event type, which determines the description at the header level, and they can also be, we can also have them at the line level associated with the line type. So now let's go and talk about the line type and what it is. So line types. Journal levels can have different type. Journal entries can have different types of line types. Okay. So the subledger module with which we are familiar with at the moment is AP. Okay. Payables. So when we're creating an invoice, what do we usually enter? We usually enter an expense in the distribution account, right? So that's a line type. That's the expense line. Okay. We usually enter the expense distribution, and then in our financial options, we already entered the liability account, okay, which is automatically given, populated by the system when we create accounting, because it's something that we have specified. So when you're entering an invoice, you are acknowledging an expense, so you're increasing your expense, okay, and then you're also increasing your liability, okay, and you'll reduce those ones when you pay the invoice. So you can have various types of line types. In those invoices, for example, if you're paying tax, you can have a line that shows that the tax that you're paying. If you're paying freight charges, you can have a line that also shows that. Okay. Now we have said that the line type creates journal lines in journals. Okay. What this means is that going back, SLA determines how accounting is created. So when we are configuring the line type, we are configuring how the lines will be generated based on the logic that we define in that particular line type. All right. So what does a line type define? We have already said this: the side of the line, whether is it a debit or a credit. Okay. So if it's an invoice, for example, an invoice will have an expense line, right? And it also have the liability. Okay. We know that the expense line will be debited, right? Because when you're increasing your expense, you're debiting it. So that's a debit line. And the liability account will be credited, because when you're increasing your liability, you credit it. Okay. So that is logic that's determined by the line type. The balance type is also determined by that particular, by the line type. Okay. So you can create a line type for which the balance is a budget balance, depending on what that line type is. Okay. It also determines the level of summarization, but within the journal, okay? So, for example, if you have 10 lines, but all of them are for the same account combination, then you can have the option to either do a summary within the journal or to display each line individually. All right. So those are some of the things that are determined by the line type. Just like we talked about with the journal entry descriptions, we have logic or conditions that can be created to determine when that particular line type is used. Okay. So you can say, for example, based on the invoice type, if the invoice is a standard invoice or the invoice is maybe a debit memo or a credit memo, then you want that when you create accounting, then the line type that is used is going to be that particular line type that you have defined. And within that line type, you will have also defined you'll have also defined these options. So now let me go here. So when you define the logic for your line type, it will affect this part here, okay? So for example, for this line, which is an expense line, there is logic defined for it that says that for this particular event type, right, which is the invoice validated, then this will be a debit line, okay, and the balance is an actual balance, and it will also show the level of summarization. So you can see, for example, here these are the lines that have been produced for this journal. The way these lines have been produced is based on the logic which is defined in the line type. All right. Okay, so now let me take you back again. I want to, until we finish these descriptions, I want us to keep thinking about how all these features are associated. So at the very top, it's the subledger accounting method, which contains many multiple application accounting definitions. And then the application accounting definitions contain journal line definitions, which contain journal entry setup components. Those components are the line type, the account derivation rules, and the journal entry description. I know we haven't talked about journal account derivation rules. We are going to talk about them in our next session. But of course, you can tell that the account derivation rules, they have to be associated somehow with the line type, right? Because, for example, if the line type is an expense, it's an expense line, then the account that is going to be associated here has to be an expense account. The account derivation rules will, the logic we define here will do other things. For example, how the account is is obtained, the combination, is it obtained segment by segment, or is it just picked the whole account from the flex field, okay? But I don't want to introduce that right now. We are going to talk about it in our next session. So I just advise to keep thinking about how all these features are associated with each other, and that is how we are going to get a very clear picture of the whole SLA module. Anyway, that's it for this session. So Bob, unless you have something to add, we can end the lesson there.
Thank you, Victor.